God Almighty is head of this nation.
Ours should be the bold ambition to claim Washington, D.C. for Christ and disciple it to once again walk in the ways of God.
That was a clip that we saw in part 2 of this series, and I hope you're watching these in order. Anyway, in short, that clip speaks volumes. I want you to take a look at the name of the video. I mean, really look at it and take it in, because there's so much there that we need to unpack in order to understand the past, present, and future of the Sunday Law. The video, as you can see, is entitled, Make Washington, D.C. Christian Again. And it speaks to the desire among these Christians to essentially stage a coup of the government. But this coup is not like the military coups that we've seen take place around the world. It's not a coup that takes place on a physical level, but rather it's one that they believe begins in the spiritual realm and then continues into society. Unlike the coups we've seen where people try to overthrow the government in the name of a world leader, their coup is one that's being done in the name of the Lord. They believe this is God's country and no one is going to take it from them.
Listen, this is God's nation and nobody is going to take it away from him.
That's right.
God Almighty is head of this nation.
They believe that they have a mandate to advance God's will through government. They believe that they have a mandate, or dare I say, a 7-mountain mandate.
And the message was that there are 7 molders of culture, or 7 world kingdoms, and that he who could take those kingdoms could take the harvest of nations. Now, this illustration is the way I see it. I look at it this way. I see those 7 molders of culture as being the religion mountain, as a metaphor for something you've got to take or climb. Then we have education, we could say, family. These are in no particular order of importance. They all represent the forces that shape societies and nations. Government, media, art, which is the entertainment mountain, and business, which is where we have the economics mountain happening also. Now, these 7 fields of influence are very powerful, so powerful, in fact, that he who occupies the top of those mountains can literally shape the agenda that forms nations.
They believe that they have a mandate to conquer every facet of society so that God can reign on this earth. In other words, they want to help God out so that he can be ruler. As we saw in the last episode, this mindset has been growing for well over a century. And today, we're going to find out how it began and where it's headed. And it started much further back than when Sabbath keepers were arrested for working on Sunday, and even further back than 1888, when Henry Blair tried to pass a law that said, a bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, as a day of rest, and to promote its observance as a day of religious worship. That phrase, Lord's Day, appeared 3 times in that bill. And the question begs to be asked, why is it in there? Why would he need to put that in a document dealing with just giving people a day off on Sunday? The answer to that question is simple, and it's the same reason that the Project 2025 document stated that the Sabbath day of rest would, and I quote, default to Sunday. Now here's another question. Why would it default to Sunday? Who gets to determine that? It's clear that there's something deeper going on here than just Sunday. As we saw in the previous episode, the foundation of this is built on an idea. And that idea is that God is sovereign, and that because he's sovereign, and I'm going to make up a word here, many Christians believe that they should help his sovereignness by taking over the government. But to truly understand where this push for Sunday legislation began, we have to go back much further than 1888, back to the moment when religious rest was first woven into civil law. Come with me further back in time, back to the 4th century. It was a time of turmoil in society. Just as the prophecies of Daniel 2, 7, 8, and 11 had predicted, the 4th kingdom, known as the Roman Empire, or as some like to call it, the pagan Roman Empire, was on a serious decline. The emperors were trying to hold society together, and part of that included trying to get everyone on the same page in regards to the worship of the gods, and I'm talking about the pagan gods. As a result, Christians were singled out. And as predicted in the prophecies contained in Revelation chapter 2, a vicious 10-year persecution had broken out. Emperor Diocletian had instituted another in a cycle of persecutions that had taken place off and on for over 300 years, and Christians were growing weary of being the scourge of society. Many were giving up their faith, and then something happened. And much like Mariah Carey said in one of her most famous songs, for them, a hero came along, and his name was Constantine. Soon enough, Constantine would experience a so-called conversion and begin conquering under the emblem of the cross and in the name of the Lord. And his rise to power would essentially bring an end to the Christian persecution and an end to Christians being second-class citizens. It was then that Christianity would begin its ascent into replacing the pagan religions and become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Within a decade or two, something pivotal would happen that would reshape the Roman Empire, and the ripple effects of what happened are still being felt today. And that thing was that Constantine would pass the very first Sunday law in history. And as I'm sure that you know, it would not be the last. The thing is that many Sabbath keepers, including many Seventh-day Adventists, have always thought that this move was Constantine changing the Sabbath. And while there is some truth to that, it's not the full story. Constantine didn't change the Sabbath himself, but rather he legislated a day of rest because he saw that many Christians were already taking Sunday as a day of rest, in violation of the fourth commandment, I might add. What Constantine did was similar to what we find in the Project 2025 document. What he did was similar to what Wilbur Crafts tried to do and what Pope Leo XIII tried to do. Essentially, Constantine had passed a labor law that obviously had religious connections, and you can read it for yourself. Constantine's law called for a cessation of work, similar to the Sabbath commandment. And he stated that all judges and townships and all occupations of trade rest on the venerable day of the sun. This was something new at this time, a day of rest for pagans and Christians alike, a day for some commonality, a day that could perhaps unite society and by extension, the empire, a day that could perhaps make Rome great again. Hint, hint. And it's not just me that believes the hint, hint. Take a look at this clip discussing making Sunday a day of rest in Europe. And please pay close attention to what this woman has to say.
In our fast-paced world filled with deadlines, responsibilities, meetings, and the constant buzz of technology, it's easy to overlook what is important in life and the importance of collectively taking a break. Already the Roman Emperor Constantine recognized the special importance of a common day off and introduced the work-free Sunday. To protect the Sunday as a common day off is especially important for our societies, for the social cohesion.
She said it, not me. Clearly, the connection is being made to Constantine in regard to legislating a day of rest. And this is not an Adventist that's making this connection, as some people are quick to say. This is just a regular person that's able to take an unbiased look at history and see the impact that Constantine had. And by the way, it's also important to note that this is not the first person to make a Constantine connection, as we discussed in a recent video. Here's another clip from a Christian making the Constantine connection.
You remind me of the great Roman Emperor, Constantine the Great. It is my great honor to present you with this holy cross. This cross is the very symbol that led this great Roman Emperor Constantine to victory.
Now, just to be clear, as I say in all my videos, this is not about Donald Trump. Trump is simply a placeholder that Christians are using to push forward their agenda, and they will use anybody, whether Trump or someone else, to help them push their agenda along. And I want you to keep that in mind. The church looking to the state to protect them. In a similar way, Constantine did this for the church in the past. And because of this Constantine connection, it is so important to understand why Constantine did what he did. Generally speaking, many believe that the passing of that Sunday law was sort of a dog whistle to the Christians, signaling that Constantine would fight for them. I mean, obviously, history tells us that he was already fighting under the banner of the cross and was now claiming to be a Christian. And many Christians heard the whistle loud and clear. Over time, Christian leaders began responding to this whistle. They saw in Constantine what they believed was a precursor to the ultimate triumph of Christianity. They now believed that God was sovereign and that part of his conquering would be to conquer Rome in the name of God. It was out of this dangerous theology that a new order of things would take place that would change the Roman Empire and the history of humanity forever. And as you're about to see more clearly, it's about to change America as well. Most people, when looking at the very first Sunday law, only focus on Constantine, but there was another man who was equally important, if not more important, to understand in regards to the merging of church and state. And that man was the church father named Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius was arguably Constantine's biggest supporter, even writing his biography. He came to see the rise of Constantine as the fulfillment of God's sovereign will. From his perspective, the entire arc of human history was moving towards the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And for him, Constantine's rise and subsequent conversion was the fulfillment and manifestation of God's will for humanity. This is so similar to what we see taking place today among Christian leaders. They're fighting to establish God's kingdom on earth. And for them, any president, whether Trump or anyone else that will support their cause, is seen as an extension of God performing his will through government. This is why so many can sit back unconcerned about how these laws will affect those who are not Christians. It's because they believe that they have a divine right to advance God's will through government. And much like Christ said while he was on earth, that men will persecute others thinking that they're doing the will of God. And it can, has, and will be done with a clear conscience. Or maybe I should say, a seared conscience. For Eusebius, who can be seen as the spiritual father of the ideology of the union of church and state, he envisioned a symphony between the church and state, both working together under divine direction, with the church supporting the emperor through prayer and moral guidance, and the emperor supporting the church through protection and legislation. These two principles working together is what you're looking at when you see these religious leaders clamoring to get their hands on the president to pray for him. This is what you're seeing when the president stands in front of a church to take a picture holding the Bible. It's a statement that he is with the church to make Washington, D.C. Christian again. Eusebius saw Constantine as one that would protect the church through legislation. And as a matter of fact, it probably looked and sounded like this.
So let me state this right up front. A Trump administration, our Christian heritage, will be cherished, protected, defended like you've never seen before.
The labor laws that Constantine promoted and the theology that Eusebius promoted combined to create a spark in the Roman Empire that would ultimately lead to the union of church and state. The union was prophesied to take place with the imagery contained in Revelation chapter 2, with the church being characterized as the harlot, committing fornication with the kings of the earth, and also again in Revelation chapter 17, that uses the symbol of a harlot riding a beast, emphasizing the control that the church would have over the state. I want to pause here for a bit to go back to the future for a moment and show you something that happened when the recent Pope, Pope Leo XIV, was elected. Shortly after his election, Vice President J.D. Vance met with the new Pope and gave him a special gift. Actually, you can see several gifts on this table. However, it's not the Chicago Bears jersey that I want to focus on. It's actually the book. This book was a very special book, written by a very important figure you need to understand as we're putting all of these pieces together regarding the labor pains. The book is entitled The City of God. And I'm not the only one that noticed this book. In this article by the New York Times, they also took notice of this in an article named The Book That Can Inspire Both a Pope and a Politician. What can a 5th century text by St. Augustine tell us about the priorities of the two most powerful American Catholics? This article goes on to make the following statements about this book. The two most prominent American Catholics have each been profoundly influenced by a 1,600-year-old book about why the Roman Empire was falling apart. What makes it so convincing, and why are powerful people still turning to it for guidance and insight? Leo is most likely the last person who would have needed the introduction. As a member of a religious order inspired by Augustine, the Pope has drawn on City of God repeatedly. City of God stands alongside classic works like Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. Scholars contend it was second only to the Bible in influence during the Middle Ages. What was stated in that article speaks volumes, and we need to understand who Augustine is, because if you didn't know, Pope Leo XIV comes from the Augustinian order within Catholicism, and as you're about to see, his theology, along with Leo XIII's theology, and the theology of Christian men and women looking to legislate Sunday rest, stem from this man. Augustine was a prominent church father that, as I said, wrote this work, The City of God. While we can't go into full detail on this work, it suffices to say that it was written in response to the charge that Christianity was responsible for the downfall of the Roman Empire. In this work, he argues that it wasn't the church's fault, but rather that Rome fell because it was corrupt and godless, and that in order to truly have a great nation, it is best that the nation be guided by leaders that carry out justice based on the principles found in the Word of God. And yes, while that sounds good in principle, unfortunately, humanity always takes things further than God takes them, ultimately leading to coercion and force in the name of God. Augustine believed that there were two metaphorical cities, the city of God, which is the heavenly kingdom, and the city of men, characterized by the earthly kingdoms. These two kingdoms must necessarily exist together, with the state not interfering with the church, and the state being responsible for maintaining order and peace, which sounds like a good thing, but like I said, it never stops there. Augustine also believed that the church should be protected by the state. And these are the same sentiments that Pope Leo XIII expressed in his encyclical Immortale Dei, as he referenced the city of God and the city of man in this encyclical, and made a case that sounded like this. So too, it is a sin for the state not to have care for religion as something beyond its scope, or as of no practical benefit, for we are bound absolutely to worship God in that way which he has shown to be his will. All who rule, therefore, would hold in honor the holy name of God, and one of their chief duties must be to favor religion, to protect it, to shield it under the credit and sanction of the laws, and neither to organize nor enact any measure that may compromise its safety. Leo goes on to make the case that the religion that must be protected is the religion of the Christian church. While that sounds good for many in theory, you need to understand the eventuality of this reality. And let's do that by going back to the source, St. Augustine. Eventually, Augustine took a position that set the foundation for this idea of using the state to influence the adherents of Christians, and by extension, the Christian faith. In one of his letters dealing with a group of Christians that were rebelling against the mainline church during his day, he had this to say: "It is better certainly that men should be led to worship God by teaching than by fear of punishment or pain. But because the former is better, the latter must not therefore be neglected. Many are found to yield first to the fear of laws and afterwards to the teaching of the truth." In other words, Augustine was making the case that it was best to use teaching instead of punishment to bring people to the truth. But unfortunately, because man's nature is one of rebellion, he believed at times it is necessary to sort of help him along through coercion. Because after all, as he saw it, it's better to use the state for a little coercion if it means that you can save man's soul. And this is where the problem comes in. This is where the ideas of Augustine and Eusebius cross into a new realm that Paul wrote about in 2 Thessalonians when he said, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Paul understood this because he was familiar with Daniel chapter 7, that a power would emerge that would think to change times and laws by changing the Sabbath, among other things, and that this power would coerce and persecute those that did not go along. When a man presumes to place himself in the position of God, to use coercive tactics, and to use the government to get people to honor the so-called Lord's Day, he does so in direct contradiction to the character of God. The fact of the matter is that God is no longer running a theocracy, but men are trying desperately to treat the government as though it is a theocracy. It always starts with good intentions, but it always goes off the rails. And this was the case during early Christianity as well. Initially, Augustine favored persuasion to reach people's hearts. However, eventually, as he saw certain rebellion taking place in the church, and he saw the pressure from the state and that the threat of legal penalties caused some to comply, he changed his position and was willing to entertain coercion if it could bring the people back to a place where they would believe the truth. After 1600 years, absolutely nothing has changed. Christians are still being influenced by that theology that shaped the church-state relations during the Dark Ages. Today, people, including politicians, are increasingly calling for the church to control the state. You know, like this. What I need you to understand is that what we're seeing take place now in society and what we saw take place in the late 1800s is much deeper than just a Sunday law. We need to have a deeper and more broad view of the work that we need to be a part of. Before the mark of the beast comes the image to the beast. And the image to the beast is rooted in these theologies that sees Christians turn to the state for assistance, protection, and correction. Before the papacy became the papacy, it was these ideas and concepts that slowly took shape to bring the church that had been persecuted to a place where they became the persecutor. And to find out what's going to happen in the future, we need to simply look to the past and understand that this theology is what was at the foundation of the development of the so-called Holy Roman Empire that controlled the consciences of men for hundreds of years. The image will be formed in the exact same way, which is why we need more men and women who see the dangers of religious overtones and undertones creeping into the push to make Washington, D.C. Christian again. In the book The Great Controversy, this connection is clearly made in the following statement. When the early church became corrupted by departing from the simplicity of the gospel and accepting the heathen rites and customs, she lost the spirit and power of God. And in order to control the consciences of the people, she sought the power of the secular power. The result was the papacy, a church that controlled the power of the state and employed it to further her own ends, especially for the punishment of heresy. In order for the United States to form an image of the beast, the religious power must so control the civil government that the authority of the state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. This is the Sunday law blueprint. This is how the labor pains will return. Just like Constantine sought to unify a crumbling empire through a common day of rest, today's political and religious leaders are once again turning to Sunday, not just as a tradition, not just as a day off, but as a tool for shaping society. Just like Eusebius and Augustine and Pope Leo XIII, many Christian leaders today believe wholeheartedly that what they are doing is best for society. While the intentions may be noble, the results will be far from noble. And this is why we need to have these discussions. As we close today, I want to be clear that none of these people now keeping Sunday and pushing for Sunday have what the Bible describes as the mark of the beast. However, they are now entering dangerous territory by trying to add a religious slant to their legislation. This movement is eventually going to go off the rails. And when it does, this acceptance of force and coercion regarding Sunday sacredness will then morph into men and women receiving the mark of the beast. I pray that you see that this is not just about a day. This is about who God is fundamentally and how he deals with humanity through the grace offered through faith as opposed to the control that is offered through force and coercion. As we close today, I want to leave you with this quote from the book, The Desire of Ages, because this quote says it all. But today in the religious world, there are multitudes who, as they believe, are working for the establishment of the kingdom of Christ as an earthly and temporal kingdom. They desire to make our Lord the ruler of the kingdoms of this world, the ruler in its courts and camps, its legislative halls, its palaces and marketplaces. They expect him to rule through legal enactments enforced by human authority. Since Christ is not now here in person, they themselves will undertake to act in his stead, to execute the laws of his kingdom. The establishment of such a kingdom is what the Jews desired in the days of Christ. They would have received Jesus had he been willing to establish a temporal kingdom, to enforce what they regarded as the laws of God, and to make them the expositors of his will and the agents of his authority. But he said, My kingdom is not of this world. He would not accept the earthly throne. People are looking for a theocracy that God is not looking for. It starts with labor pains, promising that what is being done in the name of God is best for society. But inevitably, it will indeed lead to the sword. Let's not sit in silent expectation. Let's revive the work of men and women from the past in combating these ideas. And by God's grace, let's redeem more time to work for the salvation of souls. God bless.